I'm Reverend Kim Polchow. I'm the pastor of Marshfield UMC, who produces the streams MUMC here on YouTube. Welcome to episode 2, part 2 of the United Monarchy. This is when we're going to talk about Saul. Let's talk about Saul, the very first king. So in the book of Samuel, we get not one, not two, but 3 stories of how Saul became king. Saul is anointed by Samuel, who was the last prophet. Samuel sees Saul. He's head and shoulders above the rest. So they always say he's like a head taller than everyone, and he's sort of outstanding. Saul is from Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, which was not the strongest tribe by any means. And so there's some concern about this. Like, I'm not the best guy. I'm not from the best tribe. Why would you pick me? Saul gets chosen to be the king by Samuel. God points Saul out to Samuel. So that happens. In the next selection of Saul as king, they have this public gathering and they cast lots. Interesting. They cast lots to see, which area, which tribe, which clan within each tribe, which one is going to have the ruler from it. And finally, it all gets narrowed down to it's the sons of this man. And Saul is missing. He's actually hiding. We later find out he's about 30 years old. So he's hiding from this possibility. And he's sort of surprised to be chosen as king, which is weird because he's already been chosen as king. And then we get the third version where Saul goes out and he proves himself with military might. And so the people declare him king. That's those layers that I've been talking about, the different layers of different traditions coming together and being put together by DTRH. DTRH provides the transition so that it actually reads like it is a solid story and that really happened over and over again. But I will say, when I went back and read 1 Samuel this week, I was struck by how many times you can see those layered stories where you get one story, you get another story. We'll do a little list of the ones I noticed this week later. Once Saul rises to power as the king, we don't get a lot of very good stories about him. He seems to have some military leadership skills, but he very clearly makes a few mistakes. Well, he makes a lot of mistakes, but the mistakes that have him sort of fall from grace and have God and Samuel turn their back on Saul are very clearly delineated for us, and you might find them a little bit surprising. The first mistake is that while he's waiting to go into battle, and often in these stories, there's issues about like whether the troops are eating or not eating, whether Saul's fasting or David's fasting, and everybody has enough to eat. There's this situation in which Saul is waiting for Samuel to come so that they can go to battle. And they need Samuel because Samuel's going to come and make the sacrifices and beseech the Lord for victory. Saul gets tired of waiting and Saul just makes the sacrifices, which incenses Samuel. He's totally usurping Samuel's role. I kind of feel bad for Saul in this story. You can imagine him going, we're on the eve of battle and he hasn't shown up. It's better to just go to God directly. No. Samuel and God are very unhappy with Saul for doing this, particularly Samuel. Now we come back to the issue of fasting. In chapter 14, there's this sort of sortie, like this little mission that Jonathan goes off on with a few people, and he doesn't tell everybody else. Jonathan is Saul's son. Jonathan takes off and he goes to scare some Philistines. And so he does this whole shtick where he surprises the Philistines and he ends up killing some of them. And he comes back. While he's gone, Saul tells all the soldiers that they have to fast, that he is requiring a fast of them to make God happy with them before they have this battle with the Philistines. And they show up. Jonathan shows up. He has been very successful in his battle, But Jonathan and all the other men go into a field that is filled with honey, like honey is just there on the ground. And Jonathan, not knowing, not having received the instructions that he was not allowed to eat, bent down, grabbed some of the honey and ate. And it says that his eyes brightened when he did it. Like it made him feel better. Of course, it probably raised his blood sugar. Saul figures out that someone has not fasted, has broken his vow of fasting. And so he swears he's going to punish them by death, even if it's Jonathan. And of course, it is Jonathan. And then the men that are in his troops just beg him and get very upset because Jonathan is the reason they're going to succeed. Why would you kill him, your own son? And so Jonathan doesn't get killed. Saul pulls his hand. For some reason, this makes everybody really mad. Okay, so this is one of Saul's crucial mistakes that lead to God and Samuel being upset with him. The third thing that happens is in chapter 15, and this is a battle with the Amalekites, and Saul is told very clearly that he is to go kill all of the Amalekites. He is to slaughter every man, woman, and child and all of their cattle. So Saul goes and he does this, but he lets somebody get away, and he doesn't kill all the cattle because, what did they do, I guess? And so God gets really angry with Saul because he didn't follow the instructions and he didn't kill all of them. It can be a little confounding from the 21st century that these were the things that Saul did wrong, that earned him the disfavor and had God and Samuel turn their back on Saul. After these incidents, a strange thing happens to Saul. And some scholars think that probably some of it could be described as mental illness. The description of what happens is that the Spirit of the Lord leaves him and goes to rest on Daniel, and that God sends a spirit to sort of bother Saul or disturb Saul, sort of an evil spirit falls upon Saul, and his behavior becomes very strange. He cannot be soothed, and the only thing that soothes him is if this little boy, the son of Jesse, David, comes and plays for him. And so we get scenes in which David is playing and Saul's spirit is soothed, which makes sense, right? If God's spirit is already with David. David calming Saul is in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. In chapter 17, we have the story of David and Goliath. The Philistines come. They have this really big hero. Nobody can stand against him. Up comes this young man, not a boy, just barely not a boy, according to scripture. And he is introduced to Saul, and it's a first introduction. So it can be a little jarring. There are those layers we talked about, this tradition and that tradition layered and put together. But when you read them all the way through, if you read 16 into 17, you're going to say, David already knows Saul. Saul already knows David. That's the little boy that soothes his spirit with his playing. And now he meets him and he's never seen him before. It's a little bit unusual. As David grows, we start to hear how successful he is in battle. There's a phrase that goes around, and you hear it several times in Samuel. Saul killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. So David is more successful in battle. And as David grows, he becomes very, very close with Jonathan, Saul's son. They become best friends. And Saul seeks to sort of tame David by bringing him into the family. He offers him his oldest daughter in marriage, and David backs out of that. And then pretty soon he offers him his daughter, Michal, who is in love with David, and they end up getting married. And so David becomes Saul's son-in-law, and David is also his son's best friend. But Saul has this spirit upon him, right, that is not the good, loving spirit of the Lord, but another spirit. And occasionally he tries to kill David. So I laughed about that. A couple of times David is standing around with Saul, and all of a sudden Saul grabs a spear and just throws it at David. I mean, it would be so upsetting if you were David, to go visit Saul, because it might be a good day, or he might throw a spear at you and try to kill you and pin you to the wall. Between chapter 19 and 26 of 1 Samuel, they go back and forth, David running in different directions, trying to get away from Saul, trying to hide, maybe hiding his family, maybe just hiding himself and his troops. And then at other times he's found and Saul shows up and Saul knows where he is. And it's a cycle that repeats itself. We'll go over later some of the parts of that cycle that we might find interesting. And then David goes to work for the Philistines. And this is fairly unbelievable. He becomes a mercenary for their enemy. We are told that he mostly goes out and he attacks the Canaanites, because remember, we have Canaanites and we have Israelites, we have some Hittites up in the north, and now we've got the Philistines over here in these 5 cities. And so David is going out on behalf of the Philistines and battling Israel's enemy, the Canaanites. But eventually, of course, the day comes when they're going to battle the Israelites, and David's loyalty is going to be tested, but the king decides to release him from service. This is the battle in which we will find the demise of Saul. Before Saul dies, we know he's going to die because he goes to a seer. There have been no seers anymore since Samuel has died, because Samuel died after turning his back on Saul and not seeing him anymore. He passes away, and Saul passes this law that there aren't going to be any more seers, which, probably Samuel and seers and prophets were burrs in the saddle to him. Now, we say seer, and the Bible actually clarifies that they were considered to be seers and later called prophets. So now you can understand them as prophets, but then they were called seers. You get this kind of explanatory stuff. Kind of smells like DTRH to me, actually. So Saul seeks out this medium, sometimes called the Witch of Endor. Isn't that interesting? It sounds like something from a Tolkien book. It probably was used in a Tolkien book. Saul seeks out this medium and he wants to talk to Samuel, and you get this weird moment with sort of the ghost of Samuel rises up and tells Saul that he's going to die and his sons are going to die. At the very end of 1 Samuel, we get the story of Saul begging his sword bearer to kill him, and he won't do it. And so Saul falls on his own sword. When we turn around and start 2 Samuel, which is, of course, just the second half of the same book, you get the story of someone else killing Saul, or at least finishing him off. Let's talk about some of the weirdness in this story, because if you read these chapters, you may be very prepared by the content that I've shared here, but you might find some things very confusing. I noticed lots of things when I read it this week. The first thing is the repeats. Oh my goodness, there are those layers of traditions upon each other. So some of the things I noticed were Samuel dies a couple times. I mean, he only dies once, but it is introduced to the reader that Samuel died 2 times. Of course, I've mentioned that David and Saul meet twice, and I mentioned at the beginning and in the last part of the episode that Saul is chosen to be king 3 times. David meets this leader named Achish 2 times. The first time David seems afraid, and the second time Achish seems afraid. It's very unusual. It's like the second story doesn't know the first story was there, which is what happens when you get different traditions layered together. There are also phrases that are repeated over and over again that we're going to talk about at the end of this part of the episode. One of them is basically, I could have killed you, but I didn't. These repeated phrases are fascinating, and they tell us something very interesting about the work of Samuel. So some of the rather odd things I noticed as I was reading it and studying it again, there are a couple of times where they decide something by casting lots. For example, when they decide who's going to be king, which tribe, which clan, all that stuff, they do it by casting lots. That is not something, let me just say, I'm really glad churches don't make decisions anymore by casting lots and thinking that's God's will. It's sort of like God's in control of the dice. We also have the presence of idols. If you went through the first episode, I talked about that the Canaanites and the Israelites were neighbors, and that the Asherah temples and things, the little statues and idols and things that were around, those were like what the neighbors had. And the Israelites and Canaanites mostly differed in their religious beliefs. I always say that there wouldn't be so many prohibitions about having idols in your houses or worshiping idols if the Israelites weren't doing it. Once my kid has learned something, I don't keep going back and reminding him of the lessons that he learned during his babyhood. Oh, don't do that with your diaper. He doesn't have a diaper. I don't have to say that anymore. When you read these stories and you hear them talking about idols, you realize they had idols around, and they have idols in this story, particularly when Michal hides David from Saul at one point. She puts an idol in his bed and then some goat hair on top of it. So they had an idol in the house of Saul and David. It's very interesting. There is a repeated reference to putting on ephods or ephods, ephods. This is a ceremonial linen garment that was worn by priests. And it's like when David decides to do something, he tells them to get out the ephods. They keep putting these things on and off. I'm not sure if he's sort of taking priestly authority by doing that or making sure that God doesn't get mad at him like God got mad at Saul for doing the prophet's job. But you will see mention of that item of clothing over and over again in David's instructions. Another thing that struck me in here is that I've talked about how all the different groups of people in Canaan, they can kind of get smushed together in our brain, and it just feels like those people, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, it's all the same thing. The Moabites show up in this story. David goes and hides with the Moabites with his family for a while. You may remember the Moabites. The Moabites are the descendants of Lot and Lot's oldest daughter. The Moabites basically came forth from that incestuous moment that followed the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt, and Lot was alone with his daughters, and they got him drunk, and peoples were born from them. When you run into the Moabites, we're running into cousins, kind of cousins from the wrong side of the blanket. The story of David and Goliath is one of the pillars of Vacation Bible School and Children's Sunday School. It's such an empowering story to kids. What I want to focus on here is that David carefully saved Goliath's sword in the story of David Goliath and sort of stowed it away. Later in the story, in that section between 19 and 26, where David's on the run, he goes and he has no sword, he has no weapons, and he runs into a priest and he tells him he needs a weapon, and the priest gives him Goliath's sword. I mean, it's like Excalibur. There's none other like it. And David has this powerful sword that belonged to the Philistine that he defeated, Goliath. And then Saul, oddly, calls together these priests related to this guy who helped David out, and he has someone slaughter all of them. To me, that's a little worse than the things he's done that got God and Samuel to turn away, but he's already kind of too far gone with them for that to be too much of an issue. In chapter 25, we get the odd side story of Abigail. Abigail becomes David's wife. But before Abigail becomes David's wife, she helps David, even though her husband wouldn't have helped him. And she tries to sort of overcome the evil her husband will do. And there's a banquet and a weird situation with the husband. And if this is ringing bells for you, this is one of the stories that is included in Nicole Wilkinson Duran's book, Having Men for Dinner. But when I teach the class, I don't include the story of Abigail because it follows the pattern, but it has some outlying issues. One of them is Abigail really doesn't kill her husband. She doesn't even have him killed. She just sort of helps somebody else, and her husband is punished because he didn't give the help. And then she ends up marrying David and becoming his The second of his wives that he currently has, because once he ran away from Saul, Saul gave his daughter Michal, who was married to David previously, to someone else. So now David has 2 wives with him and one kind of back at home. And if you want to read the weirdest part of the story, you need to read about that witch at Endor in chapter 28 and Samuel's ghost coming up and being very annoyed that Saul would bother him. So I have said before that Samuel is sometimes seen by scholars as royal propaganda. That seems like a really harsh thing to say, but I want to show you some of the examples of that. One of the things that tends to make me agree with the idea that it's propaganda is the presence of those character foils, sort of like Curly and Judd. If you stand David next to Saul, David looks great. Saul looks like he's insane, which, I mean, the Bible says that he's kind of insane. David actually pretends to be insane in one of the stories. It's very, very odd. But these character foils sort of demonstrate that David is being made to look better and Saul is being made to look a little worse. One of the things we see that may inspire us to consider it from one angle as propaganda is the presence of apologetics. So apologetics are a type of literature when someone is trying to explain something to an audience that may not agree with it. So, for example, Paul was a great apologist. The Apostle Paul was a great apologist to the Gentiles. He was very good at using their philosophy and their beliefs and their understanding and explaining Jesus in a way that made sense to them. That's the work of apologetics. Apologetics will often tell a potentially hostile audience why maybe they need to rethink things. And so one of the triggers for thinking that this is apologetic and kind of apologetic or propaganda is the presence of some things that people say, you know, these are the things people say, and this is why people might say that. Sort of, let's clear the story a little bit. One of them would be Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Over and over again, this is repeated. It makes Saul so mad. It is repeated to tell us over and over again, Saul was good, David was better. Saul was good, David was better. This was the word around town. Look, the women are dancing in the street saying it. The people are saying it in the palace. Saul's good, David's better. Twice in the story, there are these really interesting moments when Saul and David are, well, Saul's after David, but David turns the tables and he goes to where Saul is. And he gets into a position where he could take Saul's life. And then he refrains from taking his life. So one time he finds him and he cuts off a piece of his robe. And then he feels awful about it. But he would feel worse about killing Saul because Saul is God's chosen king. So we get this moment where Saul then confronts David, and David says, I could have killed you, but I didn't. And then later, there's a moment with like switching of the spears, and he takes his spear, and then he lets him know, I could have killed you, but I didn't. It's very interesting. Why do we say that? Well, it makes a pretty good point that David didn't kill Saul. That would have been a serious accusation. So the suspicion that I have is that is there to dispel any kind of rumors that David was the reason Saul was gone. David's the one that's comforting him. David's being chased by him like through the hill country, and he's having all these problems, but David could have killed him, but he didn't. So it's an important point there. David did not kill Saul, and we need to know that because we need to love David. The other thing that gets explained a couple of times is a phrase that people say, is Saul also among the prophets? That is one of the most interesting questions in there. Saul gets the gift of prophesying, And twice, at least, he goes down and he gets with the other prophets and he prophesies. One time, they basically find him just laying there naked prophesying. I'm not sure what he was doing. I'm not sure what prophesying looked like at that time, that's how that would be explained. But we keep getting it explained. That is why it is said, is Saul also among the prophets? So we're kind of getting a glimpse into the rumor mill. And if the rumor mill said Saul was a prophet because Saul prophesied, that doesn't help the foil, right? That makes Judd look better than Curly. So there are two reasons given to dispel that saying. Then there's the David could have killed him, but he withheld his hand. See, he's just, he's merciful. I'm not suggesting that he actually killed Saul. I'm saying it sounds like there was a rumor and it was being dispelled because Curly's got to look great, you know? I mean, David's got to look better than Saul. So for these reasons, this is thought to be apologetic work, like trying to explain to a group that might have criticism for David or alternately praise for Saul why David was better than Saul and why Saul wasn't really that great. Of course, the reasons that Saul gets in trouble seem like weak sauce to us today, but it is enough that Saul fades into the background as David rises to power. That's what happens in these chapters, and it echoes exactly what happens at the beginning of Samuel when Samuel rises to power as Eli fades into the background. And that's the story of Saul connected to the story of Samuel, connected to the story of David. So next time, we're going to go over some of the stories of David, and I'm going to talk about a book that I've read on David that I think is particularly interesting and accessible for people to read at home. And we'll get an idea of what King David was about and some of the complexity of this biblical figure about which more is written than any other person in the Bible. Have a great week.